trying to force an entire nation to stop drinking overnight went exactly as terribly as you might expect. Instead of creating a peaceful, sober utopia, the government accidentally launched a decade of pure legislative panic. Today, we are looking at 50 of the most unhinged, bizarre, and hilariously misguided rules passed during Prohibition. Grab a perfectly legal beverage and get ready for a masterclass in spectacular government failure. 1. Selling concentrated grape juice was perfectly legal, but the government mandated a highly specific warning label. Manufacturers of products like Vine Glow were legally required to print instructions telling you exactly what not to do. The label literally warned buyers not to dissolve the brick in a gallon of water and leave it in a dark cupboard for 20 days, because that would illegally turn it into wine. They essentially forced companies to print a foolproof recipe for illegal booze right on the box. Talk about aggressive government reverse psychology. 2. The government banned recreational drinking, but they generously decided that a stiff drink was a medical necessity. Doctors were handed specialized government prescription pads specifically for prescribing whiskey, brandy, and rum. For ailments ranging from a mild toothache to general anxiety, your physician could legally prescribe you 1 pint of hard liquor every 10 days. Pharmacies suddenly became the absolute most popular speakeasies in town. 3. To stop people from drinking industrial alcohol, the government mandated that manufacturers add lethal poisons like methanol to the supply. They literally poisoned a commercial product, fully knowing desperate people would still try to drink it. Bootleggers simply hired their own chemists to filter the deadly toxins back out. This sparked a terrifyingly absurd scientific arms race between underground scientists and federal agents. It is a stunningly grim example of government regulation actively trying to eliminate the regulated citizens. 4. Juries were occasionally legally permitted to physically taste the confiscated evidence during a high-stakes trial just to confirm it was actually alcohol. Unsurprisingly, several eager jurors took this solemn civic duty far too seriously and drank deeply. Juries literally got heavily intoxicated inside the actual courtroom under the direct supervision of a highly respected federal judge. 5. Religious freedom collided with federal prohibition, creating an incredibly convenient loophole for anyone claiming to be a member of the clergy. Priests, ministers, and rabbis were granted special permits to purchase sacramental wine for their congregations. Almost overnight, the number of newly self-appointed religious leaders skyrocketed across the entire country. Suddenly, folks who hadn't stepped inside a church or synagogue in decades were having deep spiritual awakenings, provided that awakening came with a government-sanctioned case of Burgundy. 6. The aggressive war on alcohol did not just target the physical liquid. It actively targeted the simple, abstract concept of mixing drinks. Libraries and local bookstores were heavily pressured, and sometimes legally forced, to completely remove any books or encyclopedias that contained classic cocktail recipes. The government fundamentally believed that simply reading a recipe for a dry martini was a highly dangerous gateway to a life of hardened crime. They effectively tried to erase the historical memory of mixology by literally censoring the local libraries. 7. In a desperate attempt to curb public intoxication, frantic officials began targeting the accessories rather than just the alcohol itself. Several cities passed strict ordinances explicitly banning the display or sale of the common metal hip flask. Store owners were heavily fined simply for putting an empty piece of curved metal in their shop windows. It was a classic case of attacking the symptom instead of the disease, operating under the deeply flawed logic that if people didn't have a stylish silver container, they would suddenly forget how to be thirsty. 8. The puritanical sweep of Prohibition didn't stop at the bar. It aggressively invaded the kitchens of high-end restaurants. Federal agents actively raided luxury dining establishments just to confiscate culinary staples like cooking sherry, brandy for flambe, and rum for baking cakes. Highly trained French chefs were threatened with serious jail time for trying to make a traditional wine reduction sauce. Imagine being treated like a dangerous, organized crime boss simply because you wanted your roasted duck to have a properly glazed, flavorful finish. 9. Smugglers initially anchored their floating liquor stores exactly 3 miles off the coast, sitting just outside U.S. jurisdiction in safe international waters. In response, the government didn't just change the local rules, they literally changed the map. They aggressively lobbied to extend their maritime jurisdiction from 3 miles to 12 miles out into the ocean just to push the rum runners further away. 10. Since yeast is the absolute magic ingredient required to turn sugary water into alcohol, ordinary baker's yeast became a highly suspicious commodity. Grocery store clerks were instructed by federal agents to interrogate customers who bought too much yeast at one time. If a housewife purchased a suspicious amount of baking supplies, she could realistically be investigated for running a secret backyard distillery. The federal government successfully managed to turn the incredibly innocent act of baking a loaf of bread into a potential federal offense. 11. The law actively mandated that public schools teach heavily exaggerated pseudoscientific dangers of alcohol to children. Official textbooks legally had to include wild claims, like stating that taking a single sip of beer could cause your internal organs to spontaneously catch fire. Teachers were legally required to inform kids that simply smelling wine might permanently scramble their brains. The government forced schools to teach pure fiction as absolute scientific fact, just to scare an entire generation into staying completely sober for life. 12. When traditional bars were forcefully mandated to shut their doors, many tough burly saloon owners completely rebranded as cheerful ice cream parlors just to survive. Famous brewing giants like Anheuser-Busch actually pivoted to producing massive amounts of ice cream. It is genuinely hilarious to imagine a hardened, tough-talking bartender glaring at you while aggressively serving up a delightful double scoop of vanilla bean. The sheer contrast between the rugged saloon culture and delicate ice cream sundaes perfectly captures the era's absurdity. 13. Before Prohibition, local saloons heavily relied on swinging doors and frosted glass to give patrons much-needed privacy. The new federal laws strictly banned these visual barriers. Any establishment selling legal beverages had to completely remove window screens and curtains so police could stare directly inside from the street. You could not even sit down to enjoy a perfectly legal club soda without feeling like a highly suspicious goldfish trapped in a heavily monitored police aquarium. Privacy was basically outlawed along with the alcohol. 14. To successfully catch underground speakeasies in the act, federal agents were given special permission to drink alcohol while working undercover. They were essentially handed a golden ticket to legally party on the government's dime, purely for the sake of the investigation. Some famous agents racked up massive, taxpayer-funded bar tabs while supposedly gathering critical evidence. 15. The puritanical sweep of the Volstead Act was so incredibly intense that lawmakers eventually launched an absolute crusade against innocent candy. Specifically, fine chocolates filled with tiny drops of liqueur were aggressively hunted down and confiscated as dangerous contraband. Federal agents spent valuable taxpayer time raiding upscale candy shops to arrest people buying rum-filled truffles. It is genuinely absurd to think that the long, powerful arm of the law was strictly focused on stopping a mild afternoon sugar rush disguised as a crime. 16. Angostura bitters, a classic cocktail ingredient packing a hefty 44% alcohol by volume, somehow completely escaped the strict ban. How did they pull this off? The company successfully argued their product tasted so incredibly bitter on its own that no sane human would ever drink it recreationally. The government fully agreed, legally classifying this high-proof liquor as a simple food flavoring. It was a rather massive, completely unexpected legal victory for terrible-tasting, botanical liquids everywhere across the thirsty nation. 17. Lawmakers quickly realized that simply banning alcohol was not nearly enough. They had to aggressively ban the mere idea of enjoying it. Film censors began strictly prohibiting Hollywood movies from showing glamorous characters having a good time while drinking. If a prominent character consumed alcohol on screen, the script legally had to show them suffering a miserable, tragic downfall shortly after. The government essentially forced Hollywood to quietly produce mandatory, heavy-handed anti-alcohol propaganda, disguised as entertainment in every film. 18. Desperate to completely erase the nation's heavy drinking culture, the Anti-Saloon League vigorously lobbied to rewrite American history itself. They aggressively pressured book publishers to completely remove any historical references to the Founding Fathers casually enjoying alcohol. They literally wanted to sanitize George Washington's well-documented brewing habits right out of public memory. The government basically considered altering the nation's historical reality just to effectively sell the extremely fragile illusion of a completely sober past. 19. With alcohol completely outlawed across the entire nation, the sale of fancy cocktail shakers should have absolutely plummeted. Instead, clever manufacturers brilliantly rebranded them as beverage shakers, meant entirely for chilling fresh milk and mixing healthy fruit juices. Department stores proudly displayed these shiny silver containers right next to the dairy aisle. Everyone in the country simply agreed to playfully pretend they were vigorously shaking up cold milk on a wild, adventurous Saturday night. It was a hilarious, nationwide inside joke. 20. The absolute second a commercial cruise ship crossed the invisible 3-mile line into international waters, all American prohibition laws magically vanished. Shipping companies fully capitalized on this by offering wildly popular cruises to nowhere. You would literally pay for a ticket, sail 3 miles into the deep ocean, completely abandon all the federal rules for a wild weekend, and then peacefully sail right back home. It was basically a giant floating loophole perfectly designed to facilitate massive, entirely legal weekend hangovers. 21. It was not just human doctors cashing in on the incredibly lucrative medical loophole. The federal government actually permitted veterinarians to prescribe hard liquor for sick pets and livestock. Farmers and everyday pet owners suddenly discovered their cows, horses, and dogs were suffering from deep anxiety that could only be cured with a prescription pint of pure whiskey. Oddly enough, these supposedly sick animals rarely actually got to taste their own medicine. 22. The Volstead Act strictly outlawed the buying and selling of alcohol, but it technically did not make drinking it illegal if you already owned it before the law passed. Wealthy Americans simply bought massive, warehouse-sized stockpiles of premium liquor right before the ban officially went into effect in January of 1920. Politicians and millionaires legally drank their massive private reserves for a decade while aggressively punishing ordinary citizens for enjoying a simple beer. Hypocrisy has genuinely never tasted quite so perfectly aged and expensive. 23. To entirely prevent the production of hard cider, highly aggressive federal agents did not just confiscate the finished beverage. They went straight to the natural source. Government officials literally took axes to historic American apple orchards, completely destroying thousands of beautifully producing trees. They almost entirely wiped out several unique, heirloom varieties of cider apples, just to stop farmers from making a naturally occurring drink. It was a massive agricultural tragedy executed purely in the name of mandatory national sobriety. 24. The incredibly strict laws of prohibition technically only applied on American soil. Foreign embassies located directly in Washington, D.C. were legally considered international territory, meaning they were completely exempt from the nationwide alcohol ban. Almost overnight, embassy dinner parties became the hottest, most intensely exclusive tickets in the nation. Highly hypocritical American politicians who publicly voted for prohibition were constantly spotted eagerly attending these embassy parties just to score a totally legal free drink. 25. Jamaica Ginger extract was a highly popular, strongly alcoholic medicine. To stop citizens from casually drinking it, the government strictly mandated that manufacturers add incredibly foul-tasting chemicals to the recipe. Desperate bootleggers countered by adding dangerous industrial plasticizers to secretly mask the terrible taste and fool federal testing. This toxic battle directly caused tens of thousands of Americans to suffer permanent nerve damage and paralysis. The government's stubborn obsession with making things taste bad created a horrifying health disaster. 26. Farmers were allowed to produce sweet apple cider, but they were placed under tremendous legal pressure to prevent it from naturally fermenting into hard cider. The government literally expected ordinary apple farmers to magically conquer the basic laws of chemistry. If your barrel of cider sat in the barn too long, and nature naturally took its course, you were instantly transformed from a humble farmer into a bootlegging kingpin. 27. Before Prohibition, the police generally needed a solid, legally approved reason to search your private property. But because bootleggers aggressively use fast cars to smuggle liquor, the Supreme Court created a brand new sweeping rule. They decided that if cops simply suspected you had illegal booze in your vehicle, they could completely tear your car apart without ever getting a proper search warrant. The national panic over alcohol was so incredibly intense that it permanently eroded the legal boundaries of everyday American privacy on the roads. 28. Doctors were not the only medical professionals enthusiastically exploiting the massive prohibition loopholes. Dentists were also granted special government permits to purchase and administer pure alcohol to their eager patients. It was heavily used as a sterilizing agent, a crude anesthetic, and a highly potent mouthwash. Suddenly, citizens became completely obsessed with their dental hygiene, enthusiastically scheduling painful tooth extractions just to get a legal buzz in the dentist's chair. A visit to the dentist was surprisingly considered a fantastic afternoon. 29. Prohibition severely empowered massive corporations to aggressively police their own workers' private lives off the clock. Henry Ford was so fanatically obsessed with total sobriety that he deployed a private sociological department to randomly inspect his employees' actual homes. If his private corporate investigators found a single drop of illegal alcohol hidden in your personal kitchen cabinets, you were instantly fired from the company. Can you genuinely imagine your current boss showing up at your front door just to eagerly inspect your refrigerator for contraband? 30. The Fifth Amendment normally protects Americans from being punished twice for the exact same crime, but Prohibition simply bypassed that. The Supreme Court established a terrifying legal precedent stating that both state and federal governments could prosecute you for the exact same bottle of alcohol. You could legally serve serious jail time in a state prison, and the moment you walked out, the federal government could instantly arrest you again for that exact same drink. The sheer desperation to aggressively punish drinkers literally rewrote constitutional protections. 31. Before Prohibition, preserving fresh summer fruit in jars of brandy was a completely normal, everyday household chore. The new federal laws explicitly criminalize these innocent, grandmotherly treats. Government agents actually raided private homes and aggressively confiscated jars of brandied peaches, legally classifying them as highly dangerous, intoxicating beverages. 32. Since chefs still desperately needed cooking wine for their traditional recipes, the government allowed it to be sold, but with a highly repulsive catch. They legally mandated that all commercial cooking wine must be heavily mixed with massive amounts of salt. The government logic was that absolutely nobody would voluntarily drink a beverage that tasted like pure ocean water. They essentially forced the entire American culinary industry to serve completely ruined, overly salty food just to rigorously maintain the illusion of total national sobriety. 33. While federal law was already incredibly strict, local state governments often took things to a terrifying extreme. In 1925, the state of Indiana passed a highly aggressive law making it a serious crime to simply have the smell of alcohol on your breath. You did not even need to be caught actively holding a glass or acting intoxicated. A highly suspicious police officer could legally arrest you just because your afternoon mouthwash smelled slightly too festive. The government practically outlawed a specific human body odor. 34. The government's remarkably strict medical whiskey loophole accidentally created one of the most successful corporate expansions in American history. A small pharmacy chain called Walgreens brilliantly used this exact loophole to legally dispense massive amounts of prescription alcohol. They rapidly grew from just 20 small locations to over 500 massive stores during the Prohibition era. The federal government literally financed the creation of a massive, unstoppable corporate empire purely through their own sheer legislative incompetence. 35. The strict Volstead Act contained a highly controversial rule, specifically known as the nuisance padlock provision. If a commercial tenant was caught secretly selling alcohol inside a rented building, the federal government could legally padlock the entire premises for a full year. The completely innocent landlord, who had absolutely zero idea their tenant was actively running an illegal speakeasy, would entirely lose their rental income for 12 straight months. The government aggressively forced completely innocent property owners to pay for someone else's crime. 36. The fanatical obsession with stopping alcohol consumption reached such deeply paranoid levels that the government began heavily regulating cosmetic products. Manufacturers of perfumes, aftershaves, and hair tonics were legally required to heavily alter their traditional recipes. They had to inject specific, highly repulsive chemical deterrents into their beauty products to ensure desperate citizens wouldn't try to drink a bottle of cologne. You genuinely had to smell completely terrible just to legally prove to the government that you were perfectly sober. 37. The government rigidly forced their strict mainland laws onto beautiful tropical territories that practically ran on the production of rum. Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands were abruptly, legally mandated to completely destroy their massive, historic rum industries practically overnight. The federal government aggressively devastated entire local island economies purely to satisfy the strict moral demands of wealthy politicians sitting comfortably back in Washington. How would you react if the government randomly outlawed your entire local economy? 38. The Volstead Act officially promised that private homes were strictly protected from federal raids unless you were caught actively selling booze. It sounded like great legal protection, but agents aggressively abused a dirty loophole. If they simply smelled yeast or saw you making brandied peaches in the kitchen, they labeled you a dangerous manufacturer and aggressively kicked your door down anyway. The government essentially created a massive, comforting legal shield for your living room, only to aggressively bypass it right through your kitchen window. 39. As citizens continued to happily ignore the drinking rules, a deeply frustrated Congress actively passed the incredibly harsh Jones Act in 1929. This terrifying rule dramatically increased the maximum penalty for simply carrying a bottle of alcohol to an absolute maximum of 5 brutal years in a federal prison. You could legally face a significantly harsher prison sentence for holding a tiny flask of gin than someone who committed an actual robbery. 40. Since directly selling alcohol was strictly banned, clever saloon owners brilliantly invented the famous blind pig legal loophole. They would technically charge customers a small entry fee to view a highly bizarre attraction, like an oddly painted pig, and then generously offer a completely free glass of whiskey as a complimentary gift. The frustrated government had to constantly pass increasingly ridiculous, highly specific local laws, aggressively banning the paid public viewing of perfectly random farm animals just to stop the unstoppable partying. 41. Moonshiners operating in dense forests constantly face the serious threat of being tracked by federal agents. To completely confuse law enforcement, clever bootleggers actually carved blocks of wood to look exactly like cow hooves and strapped them right to their shoes. Agents would spend long days wandering through the deep woods, aggressively tracking a suspicious herd of livestock, completely unaware they were following a highly intoxicated man carrying a heavy jug of illegal moonshine. It was a brilliantly hilarious feat of absolute rural engineering. 42. The law didn't just ban hard liquor, it essentially banned anything that had even been in the same room as a fermented grape. The Volstead Act defined an intoxicating beverage as anything containing more than half of 1% alcohol. To put that absolute absurdity into perspective, a slightly overripe banana sitting on your kitchen counter right now contains more alcohol than what the federal government considered a highly illegal intoxicating beverage. They effectively criminalized natural decomposition just to keep America entirely sober. 43. Federal agents frequently dumped thousands of gallons of confiscated liquor directly into the dirty city sewers to completely destroy the evidence. However, this massive influx of highly potent, often poorly distilled moonshine caused highly unexpected urban disasters. The intense, highly concentrated alcoholic fumes would actively build up in the underground pipes, occasionally causing massive, terrifying explosions that randomly blew heavy metal manhole covers straight into the sky. 44. Because the standard bottles used by underground distillers were incredibly tall, They physically could not fit under a standard kitchen sink tap to be easily filled with water. Desperate bootleggers were forced to fill them using the only tall faucet available, the bathroom bathtub. This massive logistical annoyance birthed the famous term bathtub gin. Millions of elegant Americans were drinking highly questionable liquor mixed in the exact same porcelain basin where someone had just aggressively washed their filthy toes. 45. The Volstead Act completely outlawed the simple, historic word saloon. It was legally strictly forbidden to display the word on any commercial storefront, even if the establishment only served completely legal root beer. Lawmakers genuinely believed that just seeing the specific arrangement of those exact 6 letters would instantly trigger an uncontrollable, massive relapse in innocent pedestrians. The government literally engaged in aggressive, nationwide typography censorship purely to protect the highly fragile morality of the general public. 46. Politicians absolutely loved aggressively passing strict alcohol bans, but they truly hated actually following them. Congress literally had its own dedicated, highly reliable bootlegger named George Cassaday. Known famously as the Man in the Green Hat, he successfully made over 25 trips a day, sneaking premium liquor directly into the heavily guarded Capitol building for years. The exact same lawmakers legally destroying ordinary citizens' lives over a pint of beer were getting absolutely hammered right in their government offices. 47. Breweries aggressively lobbied to legally sell their heavy beer as medicine, and for a very brief, glorious moment, they actually succeeded. Doctors began enthusiastically prescribing heavy ales for everything from basic indigestion to sheer boredom. Congress heavily panicked at this massive loophole and hurriedly passed a brand new act strictly to ban medicinal beer. For an incredibly fleeting historical second, grabbing a completely cold brew from your local pharmacy was a highly legitimate, heavily endorsed medical treatment. 48. Before the massive alcohol ban, the federal government actually relied heavily on liquor taxes for roughly 30% of its entire annual budget. To financially survive their own reckless moral crusade, lawmakers desperately passed the 16th Amendment, permanently establishing the federal income tax. The government literally reached directly into your personal paycheck just so they could comfortably afford to make your weekend beer completely illegal. It is wild to realize that modern taxation exists partly just to stop Americans from drinking. 49. The highly aggressive campaign for total sobriety even invaded the beloved, completely innocent world of classic children's literature. Deeply concerned moral crusaders aggressively lobbied to completely ban specific fairy tales if they contained fictional characters drinking wine or loud tavern scenes. They genuinely believed that casually reading about a fictional pirate holding a simple mug of rum would instantly turn innocent toddlers into hardened criminals. The sheer, terrifying paranoia of the federal government knew absolutely no boundaries. All right, we have looked at 49 points, and there is only one left. But before number 50, it is time for the final verdict. The award for the absolute dumbest rule goes to legally permitting juries to drink confiscated evidence during trials. The fact that the government trusted random citizens to heavily pound illegal whiskey right inside a federal courtroom just to verify it was actually booze is the ultimate legal comedy. Do you agree with this verdict, or does another ridiculous rule take the crown? Let us know in the comments. And now, our final number. 50. President Warren G. Harding famously campaigned heavily on maintaining strict national prohibition, yet he was perhaps the biggest political hypocrite of all. While ordinary citizens were being violently thrown into federal prison for possessing a single bottle, Harding casually hosted massive, heavily intoxicated poker nights right inside the White House twice a week. The actual President of the United States happily served highly illegal liquor to his influential guests. How incredibly infuriating is that level of pure, unmatched political hypocrisy? Prohibition perfectly proves that giving lawmakers too much power to police your personal life is a recipe for absolute disaster. They tried to engineer a flawless, sober utopia and accidentally created a golden age for organized crime. What modern, everyday product do you think the government would ridiculously try to ban next if they suddenly panicked today? Drop your thoughts below. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications for more crazy history, and I will see you next time.